All right. Very good evening to all of you. Please sit down. At the outset, let me say that Dr. Shashi Tharoor is feeling not well at all, so we need to excuse him. And in fact, in most contexts, he will just not be able to make it today. But he had agreed to be part of this interaction, and I'm grateful to him for accepting that. He was actually in the doctor's office this morning, and even now his voice isn't good, so I just want you to bear with it. I want to take a moment to thank him for, bringing all of us here to his official residence of the Member of Parliament. We are also very fortunate that his sister, who is in California, is also visiting us. That's Shobha. And I also want to take a moment to thank his staff members, particularly Raghav, who put together this event, and also with other staff members. So without further ado, you have all, seen his bio and all the things he has done. But I'll say only one thing, that he has been my personal mentor for many years, since I met him at Harvard 20 years ago. And since then, he has been a great source of inspiration for me personally, and inspired me in the establishment and development of OP Jindal Global University. And he continues to inspire us by being part of what we do, so I'm grateful to him for that. Shashi, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Raj, and I really do apologize that I'm not only not at my best, I'm at somewhere near my worst, I have to admit. I've been laid low last night by a terrible virus, which not only gives, what have you come across that has raised your eyebrows or piqued your curiosity, and allow me to respond to that, rather than do both a lengthy speech and a Q&A as you had initially asked for. So I'm kind of cutting that in half by just asking you to raise with me what's on your mind. But to help stimulate you, let me just say today actually is the day that my latest book has hit the bookshops, all good bookstores, as they say in America. And so it's a special day for me. It's not, there's no official release event today. That's happening in February. But the latest issue of the popular magazine India Today, which is sort of our answer to Time magazine, has put this book and the issues it raises on the cover. So it really is a very big thing for me that this issue's up there. And I mention it because the book will not, on the face of it, be of any interest to all of you. It's a book called Why I Am a Hindu, and you may well imagine that for those of you who are not Hindu, that's a question that you never bother to ask of anybody why they are. But what I've tried to do in this book is to talk about this faith, the faith of some 800 million people in this country, and perhaps another 50 million or more around the world. The faith as I knew it growing up, as I've read about it, studied it, learned about it, and the way in which that faith has been distorted by our ruling political dispensation in India today into something that it never was. And the book ends with, as it were, I hope, a powerful restatement of why we need to take back Hinduism from the so-called Hindu fundamentalists. It's the kind of argument that could be made in other religions and in other societies, but has acquired a certain urgency in India, because we are going through a period in which we are contesting the very nature of what this country is all about. See, it's interesting that when India fought for its independence against British colonial rule, that the nationalist movement, thanks largely to a very clever British colonial policy of divide and rule, split along religious lines, or as we in India tend to say, communal lines. The word communal in India doesn't mean what it means in the English language anywhere else. Communal in India refers to religious bigotry. So if somebody says, you're being communal, they mean you're being a bigot, which is, of course, not what the word means anywhere else. But it split, unfortunately, along communal lines. And the Muslim League, which portrayed itself initially inaccurately, but towards the end accurately, as the most representative party of India's Muslims, won their ultimate objective, which was the partition of the country. Another country called Pakistan was created by carving up the Indian subcontinent. And suddenly, a big question had to be faced by the nationalist movement, by the people like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the number of figures who had been staunch voices of fighting for an independence that would keep everyone together, that now that Pakistan has been created as a country for India's Muslims, should India then by default become a country for India's Hindus? And fortunately, these far-sighted and visionary leaders rejected that assumption. They said, we've always fought for a freedom for everybody, and we are not going to stop now and be something we're not by giving in to the sectarian bigotry that has partitioned the soil of India. Let us not also partition the soul of India. Let us insist that India remains a country for people of every religion, caste, creed, culture, and so on. And so India, ever since independence, was just that. It was a country in which, even though a separate country had been created for India's Muslims, a significantly large number of Muslims remained in India. In fact, till about 1998, 99, we had more Muslims in India than in Pakistan. But the Pakistanis, I think, produced a few more children more rapidly than Indians did, and they're now ahead. We also have had 3 Muslim presidents. We've had Muslim heads of the armed forces, generals in the army, Muslims in ambassadorships and governorships and chief ministerships, positions of political power. We've had 3 Muslims as captains of the Indian cricket team, which of course is the greatest honor you can have in this country, far more important than being prime minister. And this is the kind of India that people like me grew up in and took for granted. With the elections of 2014, however, for the first time we have a majority being enjoyed by a political party that doesn't buy this consensus. They believe strongly, passionately, and at their core that India is a country for Hindus alone, and that not only is it just a country for Hindus, but that others live here on the sufferance of Hindus. And what's striking about this is that it goes to the very heart of conceptions of the nation. It goes to the very heart to the conceptions of the nation. When the Indian Constitution was adopted, for example, the people who are the ideological forebears of those who are in power today, they wrote pretty devastating critiques of the Constitution, saying that it's a completely Western-inspired document and should be torn up and thrown away. And what was the central reason for this statement? They said that the flaw in the Indian Constitution is that it is based on a fundamentally unacceptable idea of what is the nation. They said these westernized lawyers have written a constitution that assumes that India is a piece of territory and the constitution is for all the people upon it. Whereas they said that is wrong, because a nation is not a piece of territory, it is a people. And therefore the Indian nation is the Hindu people, and the constitution should have been written to privilege the Hindu people. There's such a fundamentally different critique of what the country is all about that it goes to the very heart of what the notion of everything, rule of law, equality amongst religions, equality amongst individuals, all of that boils down to. Now, you're all visiting Jindal University. I'm sure you're getting a great deal of what one might consider to be a somewhat more traditional exposure to what India is all about. And I have written 16 earlier books in which I have been somewhat, if you like, more conventional in my description of these issues. My best known book about India is a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium, in which I actually trace the big sweep of India's political history for the first 50 years after independence and describe the social, political, economic, legal, constitutional currents that have shaped the country or had shaped the country up to then. But now it's 20 years later, and there is a far more fundamental challenge to the idea of India than what I have been describing in my earlier books. So for me, approaching it from a different point of view, from the point of view not as a political commentator or as a constitutional scholar, which in any case I can't really claim to be, or even as a practitioner of politics, since I'm now in my, I'm close to finishing 9 years as a member of parliament and will soon embark on the 10th. If I approach it in all those ways, you'd get one of my earlier books. I said, no, let me approach this as a believing Hindu who says, I'm a Hindu, I'm proud to be a Hindu, but I'm not proud of the Hinduism that majority Hindu sentiment in this country allegedly stands for. And that's what this book is all about. So I told you this is a way of also impressing upon you how core and fundamental are the arguments going on in this country. I think it's fair to say that 70 years after the United States came into being, you had also a very fundamental argument that then led to the Civil War, a fundamental argument about the nature of US society. We are fortunately nowhere near anything remotely like a civil war. But there is a battle going on in India, and it's a battle for India's soul. And it suits the powers that be to portray it as a battle between believing Hindus and godless secularists. So it was, to me, rather important that I respond to this argument by saying it is also a battle within Hinduism between Hindus who are wedded to the pluralist, eclectic, accepting nature of their faith, and those who have chosen willfully to reduce Hinduism to a badge of identity, rather like a British football hooligan reduces their passion for their sport into a passionate, raucous cheerleading for one particular team. That seems to be what the Hindutva movement here is doing. And I'll end here, but I just want to say that one of the key points I make is that the Hinduism that I know, that I've been brought up to practice, that I have practiced, and that I have read, and I've quoted a number of Hindu texts and the works of a number of Hindu teachers, is a religion encapsulated brilliantly by the great Hindu sage Swami Vivekananda, who addressed the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 with a historic speech that in many ways encapsulated the essence of his and my faith. And then he was invited to make many more speeches, and he's remembered as the sort of first superstar, if you like, the first rock star of Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda said that, you know, my faith is one that teaches not just tolerance, but acceptance. Now, you think about that for a minute. Tolerance is actually a very patronizing thing. You think of it as a virtue, but it's not. Tolerance says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. You live in my country, I'll let you be wrong. I'll let you follow this misguided path. That's what tolerance says. Acceptance says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And we'll all get along fine in this country. That is ultimately the very big difference in the debate of what kind of Hinduism we're here to celebrate. So that's my book, Why I'm a Hindu, which hit all the good bookshops today. It also gave you a bit of an introduction to some of the core issues confronting Indian constitutionalism and the idea of India. So I'll leave it there. I'll be happy to take your questions. Was I audible enough? Were you able to hear me at the back? Okay, any questions? Yeah, sure. Tell me who you are, where you're from, what you're studying.
My name is Liam. I'm studying at UNSW.
You got to hold it closer to your mouth.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Liam. I study at UNSW. I think my question for you, and thank you so much for coming out here despite being ill, is what do you attribute the rise of Hindu nationalism to over the last, that you would have seen it happen over your 10-year, your 9-year tenure so far?
I love it.
And do you think it's related to the rise in nationalism in like other countries like the US and Australia?
Yeah, so there are a number of answers to that question. There is, first of all, a purely domestic answer, which is that this train of belief was always there. The movement led by the so-called RSS, that is the fount of this kind of thinking, goes back to the 1920s when fascist movements were rising around the world. And they were always a fringe thing. They never really had very much traction in terms of either voting percentage or seats in parliament. So we took them as a point of view, but nothing that ever truly imperiled the system. The only time they won a national election in the sense of being the largest single party was about 20 years ago, when they had to come into power through a coalition of 23 other parties. So they were not able to advance their agenda. This is the first time, 2014, that they actually have a majority on their own. So that's the first, if you like, the domestic feature. And on that domestic feature, there is also undoubtedly the concern that, that if you look at the ways in which this movement has articulated a certain frustration, it's part of a general current of identity politics in many countries, but certainly in ours, in which people think that, I mean, if you look at the very simple political logic, 80% of India is Hindu. So if we get a majority of those people, we'll win every election. Let's therefore try and organize a political cause around the Hindu identity. So that's another second rather simple reason. A third is indeed a global one, and that global one is the idea that in India today, we are seeing a branch of a global current against what one might call rootless cosmopolitanism and globalization in the name of cultural rootedness and national authenticity. In a sense, it's one of the two major currents that underpinned Donald Trump's election victory, that helped explain the Brexit vote, that gave 34% of the French vote to Marine Le Pen, that has seen Viktor Orban coming to power in Hungary and Recep Tayyip Erdogan coming to power in Turkey, and so on and so forth. There's a global tendency that says, all of you guys, you speak in the name of cosmopolitanism, but you're not true to what our country is all about, and you have basically abandoned the authenticity and rootedness we stand for. Therefore, I'm sorry about this. Therefore, rootedness and authenticity is all. And that India is as ripe for that message as any of those other countries are. And because we have this curse of the Westminster parliamentary system, where it's first past the post, this party with 31% of the vote has almost 70% of the seats in parliament. So that's the other problem. Yes? Thank you. Where are you from?
It is very, as you mentioned, it is very much circled around the Hindu population. And he also does tend to turn a blind eye to many of the religious rights. You've got the beef ban. So there are those very reservations among religious minorities. And I wonder how you saw this in coming years in terms of religious minorities. How would they? What I guess is where do you see them going? And do they? I guess will they be moving on? Will they be providing their support to the Congress in the coming months? And and I guess my second question was I got your book recently, An Era of Darkness, and I haven't managed to finish the whole book, but I read the preface, and one of the things you mentioned was you gave your Oxford speech, and you were really surprised to see the response you got from that speech, and the surprises that people had with what the British had done, and I wondered why the people were surprised at British colonization. Was it now, especially among the Indian diaspora? What was it about your speech, I guess, that resounded among those people, especially people outside, among the Indian diaspora and allies?
Okay, well, on the first one about the minorities, the BJP has never really aimed for minority support, and so they've never really enjoyed it. In fact, the BJP in 2014 became the first ever majority party in the history of India to not have a single Muslim member of parliament. In fact, they hadn't even put forward a Muslim candidate, not even for tokenistic reasons. And the only Muslims in the BJP are appointees to the upper house. The upper house in India, as with the US Senate in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, is nominally elected by the state assemblies. And so the state assemblies, you already know what your majority is. You don't really have a fair contest. If the BJP has a majority in the state, they can put anybody in the upper house if they want to, and in that degree they put the minorities, their minority people in that way. They've not sought any popular legitimacy for their minority candidates. As a result, indeed, most minority groups tend to vote for other parties, and the Congress gets a reasonably fair share of them. It varies from state to state. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, the Samajwadi Party attracts more Muslim support than the Congress does. In Bengal, the Trinamool Congress attracts more Muslim support than the Congress does. So it's not as if they all go to the Congress, but they do go to non-BJP parties. And it's very clear that if there is a serious understanding amongst the non-BJP parties to not undercut each other's candidates in the forthcoming general election, that we could pretty convincingly defeat the BJP across the country. The BJP profits from the fact that these various parties undercut each other. The BJP gets, as I said, 31%. The other 69 goes in a dozen different ways, and so they win. That's the challenge that needs to be overcome. And your second question, sorry, I'm really so ill, I'm not fully absorbing everything. Your second question was about British colonization, why did the speech go viral and so on. It's a curious thing because, in fact, when I made the speech in Oxford, now you can see it on YouTube, I literally forgot about it the next day and went on to the Hay on Wye Festival in Literature. It was about 2 or 3 weeks later that the Oxford Union posted it on YouTube, and I tweeted it, as I often do with any of my speeches. You never really know what goes viral. I think 3 of my speeches have had more than 1 million viewers, but that one got 3 million within about 24 hours. It was quite extraordinary. I met perfect strangers weeks later who told me, and they didn't know me, and they said that people they barely knew were sending this to them on email and WhatsApp saying, you have to watch this. So it sort of struck a chord that sort of seemed to reach out to something in the Indian psyche. We've all been very polite and well brought up. There's no overt hostility to the British. We believe the past should stay in the past, etc. But nor have we ever really faced up to the reckoning that I came up with in this speech. It's all there in the history lessons and the textbooks, but you have to put it together into a coherent argument. And that, sadly, is what many of them failed to do, forgot to do. And in my own case, I'm proud of the fact that by simply expressing in black and white a series of views I've held for a long time, but substantiating them with also some fairly recent research that eminent scholars have done, that I was able to not just touch a chord, but do so with some substance. And that, therefore, I think is where we ended up. I mean, I'm very pleased. The book has been hugely successful, not only in India, where it sold over 80,000 copies in hardback last year, which is quite unusual. This is a land of paperback buyers, not so much hardback buyers. But it also has been a bestseller in the UK itself. And that was very gratifying because it's helped open the eyes of the Brits to the decidedly unpleasant legacy of colonialism that many of them have been unfortunately and ignorantly proud of. Yep.
Myself is Ajay Sahota from Murdoch University, Perth, Western Australia.
Hi.
It's such an honor to listen to you today. We have to see our faces when song announced that we will lead you.
Yes.
Then there was happiness everywhere. My question is that all given me my friends from many various state universities, everybody knows you. People listen when you speak, and people read, and God has blessed you with many people have these blessings.
Thank
So
you.
you think I will use this skill of like blessings from God, like turn into you should protest in prime minister's election. I think if you choose any party, I'm sure that you will get
Other than Congress Party.
So the thing is that, Ajay, in our parliamentary system, which is the same in Australia, it doesn't work that way. In the sense that, let's say if I'd gone into America after a long international career, returned to my country, I could have tried to do an Obama kind of thing, run for the Senate somewhere, surprise all the party regulars, win my seat, establish a national presence, run for president. But in the parliamentary system, that's not possible. In the parliamentary system, the party decides whether you can run for parliament, where you can run, with what enthusiasm they will support you and help you to win your seat. And once you have won, what kind of role, authority, and position you get depends also on the party. And in India, it's compounded by something called the anti-defection law, which makes disobedience of a party whip grounds for expulsion, not just from the party, but from Parliament itself. So it's a deeply flawed system, as I have written elsewhere. But it's not a system, unfortunately, that enables anyone to run for Prime Minister. You have to be at the top echelons of your political party, and the mechanisms of that political party have to be designed towards putting you forward. I'm realistic enough to know that's impossible in my party, but equally there is no other party in India that comes even close to the kind of liberal political values that I hold. How could I join the BJP when they carry so much of baggage of bigotry? How could I join the left when they are mired in a 19th century Marxist ideology? How could I join the small regional parties which have a local vision and not a national vision? So in the end, I'm stuck where I am. I mean, I could, of course, be an independent and my voice would be heard around the country, but I'd find myself in a situation where my support around the country was a mile wide and an inch deep. That is, that I would get a few percentage almost anywhere in the country, thanks to people like you, but I would not get enough to win a seat, let alone a majority of seats in Parliament, to become a leader. That's the way it works. You have to win the majority of seats in Parliament from across the country before you, as leader of a party that wins that majority, can become Prime Minister. So being anchored in the party system is one of the curses of the parliamentary system we have, and therefore I have to be realistic and say, let me do my best to influence minds and thoughts and ideas, but accept that what I do in terms of official position is bound to be something determined much more by the party than by myself. Yeah, I think that should be the last question. I am beginning to fade. Okay, go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Ragni. I'm studying international studies at UNSW. I was just wondering, do you think that the attitude towards women and the widespread oppression of women in Indian society today is a result of what has been catalyzed by our colonial past?
Been catalyzed by?
Our colonial history, colonial past.
I missed the last few words. Colonial history, right. Yeah, I mean, India is a very unusual paradox in that you really have both sides of this particular issue. If you want, you can marshal evidence on both sides of the argument. You look at religion and culture, you find huge amounts of evidence going back to the ancient texts for women having positions of great consequence and importance. And you also find blood-curdlingly misogynist language in the ancient texts. And you can point to either to substantiate an argument that women were exalted in India or women were oppressed in India. You come to the next period, the period of Muslim rule, particularly in the north, where Islam came to India by the sword, unlike in the south where it came peacefully. And as a result, a lot of the restrictions placed on women in the north, well, Hindu women in the north, were in order to, as Hindus would explain it, to shield them from assault by the invaders. And as a result, a very patriarchal but also very oppressive set of rules was imposed upon Hindu women, including things like child marriage and parda, which was never there in Hinduism until Islam brought it along, and so on. Then you've got the British colonial period, which added to this kind of problem the Victorian morality, in which British colonial laws saw women very much as the property of their husbands, initially of their fathers and then of their husbands. And all the laws written by the British, the notorious Lord Macaulay, who drafted the Indian Penal Code in 1837, was adopted in 1861, reflect this attitude throughout. So that very often women are described as if they are property. Even things like the adultery law, which is finally 100 years, 70 years after independence, being challenged now, criminalizes a man for sleeping with another man's wife because he is actually enjoying another man's property. And it criminalizes her too. But if a single woman had sex with a married man, that's not adultery because she's nobody's property and he's welcome to her. That kind of attitude. It's really medieval, or rather to be accurate, Victorian English values that are reflected in some of these attitudes. And then you've got modern India. Now, it's so amazing to see the kinds of paradoxes. In India, we had, well, actually, before I say that, let me tell you an anecdote from my childhood. When I was in grade 6 or 7, there was an international test conducted. I'm sorry, I'm so long in the tooth. This is the 1960s I'm talking about. There was an international test conducted where 4 or 5 questions were asked to 6th or 7th graders in about 20 different countries. And I remember one of them, the question was the following. A man is driving on the highway with his father when their car has a terrible accident. The father is grievously injured. The ambulance rushes him to the hospital where he's wheeled into the operating theater while the man waits anxiously for news. A little while later, the doctor comes out of the operating theater in a lab coat and so on, embraces this waiting man and says, my son, how is that possible? Anyone wants to guess how this is possible? Yeah? The doctor's actually his mother. Exactly. Well, you'd be pleased to know that in the United States in 1967 or whatever it was, 3% of 7th graders got that answer right. Even in enlightened Sweden, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. In India, it was like 93%. Because Indians had grown up being used to women doctors. It didn't surprise them at all. We had some of the first women doctors in the world, graduating in the 1880s. The first lawyer in the English-speaking world who was a woman was an Indian woman, a lady called Cornelia Sorabji, went to Oxford to study law in 1866 at a time when no female student was studying law in Oxford. When she graduated, aced all her examinations, they told her apologetically they couldn't give her a degree because there was no provision for allowing a woman into the convocation ceremony where the degree would be given. And she went back to India and practiced law, and it was only in 1893 they invited her back to give her a degree. So we had amongst the first women lawyers, the first women doctors. We also had the first women pilots, amongst the first women CEOs, one of the first women prime ministers. So in a certain class of Indian society, gender didn't prove a barrier for women to succeed and excel. And yet, while all this is going on, you have evidence on the opposite side of the ledger. You have women being given away in child marriages, parents breaking the back to pay dowries so that somebody would take their daughter off their hands in marriage. You have misogyny of various kinds. You have unequal salaries and wages, limited opportunities in every field. Even today, for example, we have only 11% of our members of parliament are women. And of course, 49% of our population is. So very clearly, across the board, you can point to examples of discrimination as well. So what answer can I give you? India is one of these countries, I've often said this, by the way, so I'll say it again. Anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. So if I tell you that India is a terrible place for women, then you go off and meet an Indira Gandhi or the woman who led the Air Force's parade in front of President Obama when he was visiting, or all of these extraordinarily powerful and influential women, you'd say, gosh, is this the patriarchal India in which women are oppressed? It becomes very difficult to give you a clean answer, a simple answer. I think the best thing to say is that there is evidence on both sides that certainly the trend is towards greater empowerment of women, particularly greater education of women, greater literacy of women. For example, when the British left us, after 200 years of misrule, they left us with just 17% literacy. But women were only 8.8% literate. So today, the fact that India has gone up to 79% literacy and that women are up to 69%, which is actually quite pathetic. That means that 1/3 of all Indian women can't read and write. It actually is not that bad given where we started back in 1947. So you can always say that things are not great yet, they're not perfect yet, but the current is moving on in the right direction. Thank you all so much for your questions. Please continue the rest of the evening. Enjoy the lawn and food and so on. And my apologies, truly, that you didn't see or hear me at my best, but I really need to go and get my weight off my legs for a little while now, nurse this virus. May I excuse myself, Raj? Thank you all very much.